Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. I wanted to start out where we kind of left last week. We did a lot of discussion last week on the system structure of riots, and I talked about the dictator's dilemma and how the system structure would drive this escalating street battles if there continued to be confrontation. But I also gave a hope or a forecast that we had seen the peak of the violence. And when I describe violence here, I'm talking about, violent arrests, violent looting, rioting, things like that. I think we had seen the peak of that. And I wanted to follow up today because I've collected some data from a few disparate sources, which kind of illustrate the interaction between the perceived violence of something, protest sizes and things like that. And I think it speaks to the street battle that if you get caught in this dictator's dilemmas, bad things happen, but if you can avoid it, you actually get a better outcome. So I wanted to start first with looking at what we know now from the riots. So, the riots, the protests started May 25th, have been going on, and there was a period of associated violence with these protests. And there's been a debate who caused what was escalating. But this chart shows sort of what I would call the violent aspects of the riots. On the left side is the number of deaths. On the right is the arrests. And you can see here, if we in the calendar at the bottom is sort of the dates. George Floyd is murdered on the 25th of May. So this is really when the activity starts. And you can see here, I've tracked the deaths by type of person killed as best we can know. I'm getting this data from a lot of different sources, and sometimes it's a lot known. But you can see here, even though there are deaths and those deaths are serious, we're talking about a handful of deaths a day peaking at a certain point and then declining. Associated with that, a massive increase in arrests, which is a escalatory tactic. And between some of the protests, when they changed at night and different folks came in, there was looting, and there was definitely looting. I'm not trying to say there wasn't. You have violence between people defending their stores and perhaps looting it. You have violence between the police escalating with the protesters reacting to the escalations. You had this increase of violence that began really within a few days, but really began escalating. I call it the bloody weekend here, right? Friday, May 30th, was the night in Atlanta that you had very peaceful riots turn almost like that into a violent confrontation, as little bit as a half hour. And there were a couple, there was some police officers dragged and tased some college students out of their car. They've since been not only fired, but arrested. The Saturday was pretty bad, the Sunday, and then going to June 1st, this is Lafayette Park. This has become the sort of crystallized moment of overreaction in the street battle where President Trump used federal officers of a variety of agencies to sort of clear Lafayette Park. That it was before curfew. It hadn't been curfew yet. It had been a peaceful protest, but he wanted to do a photo op at the church, and he sort of cleared it. And what you see also is behind the scenes here, everyone sort of focuses on the deaths here. You have this massive increase in arrests coinciding with that. And the total deaths were accumulating here in red over time. And you can kind of see the breakdown in the mix. Most people who are dying in these protests are protesters. That tells you the danger of the police response, but they're not the only ones. The law enforcement are dying as well. We have a law enforcement office here dying, and one dying this last Sunday. I talked about that on the domestic terrorism. You also have a lot of unknown, the green. These are people who we don't know specifically what category they fell in. They may have just been bystanders caught up in the mix. That happens a lot when these protests and police are moving back and forth throughout the city. But you definitely had a peak of violence on the 1st, and then over the 3 or 4 days after that, you saw a rapid pullback of heavy police presence. And you can see that drop off here dramatically as the arrests per day plummet down. I mean, we're talking thousands of arrests a day here, dropping down to only a few hundred, and the deaths decline as well. There's a relationship between I mentioned in the dictator's dilemma, there's a definite relationship between the severity of the response made on these protests and the overall levels of violence. And it's not a whose side, which came first, the chicken or the egg. Protesters pushed too far will end up rioting. They might later have looting going on. You might have unassociated folks taking advantage of a protest. So peaceful protests happen, but then people who are criminal element take advantage of that with looting. You have store owners trying to defend their stores. Some of them have died. So you see this overall violence, but we have to put it in context. Overall, as of that I can find out to my best information, 22 people have died over 2 weeks. So we have to keep in context that this isn't like nationwide bloodshed with hundreds dying. It's tragic that it happens. And again, most of the people who have been killed are protesters or bystanders that protest. But we need to put this in perspective. And you see a lot of people trying to make the argument that everyone dying is law enforcement or everyone dying is protest. Well, it's a mix, right? This is the breakdown of who we know that's died so far, the 22 people that have died. 8 of them have been protesters, 6 of them are unknown, 4 are confirmed looters, 2 were law enforcement, and 2 were store personnel, either an owner or a guard hired to protect the storage. So these riots that associate violent riots are dangerous. They're highly dynamic. They're very fluid. There's a lot of different parties. We talked about this last week. There's a lot of different things going on in these activities that associate. When the riots get associated with the protests, they become very fluid and very dangerous. But this looks at the relation between the overall protest size and the amount that is, violence. And I think this is the part that's being missed, is there's a tendency in the media, because if it bleeds, it leads. Obviously, for political purposes, both on the left and the right, there's this desire to depict a certain perspective of violence. On the left, they want to say, the police are cracking down and killing people at all protests. On the right, they want to say, well, the protesters are turning into looters and there's nationwide mayhem. What's important to understand is that the overwhelming majority of protests were nonviolent. And you can look at this from the sizing chart here. So what I've added is the total deaths in red, which again, flatline at 22, which really was the last one I think was Saturday. You have the arrests now are scaled, and you can see the arrests here per day. What's over the top of this is the daily attendance, the number of people protesting by best estimate. Now, I've got this from a website that's linked in the sources. It's a little bit lagging, so I only have data through the 7th of June, and it will probably, if you go back and look each day, it's updating constantly. So these numbers here, the 5th, 6th, and 7th may increase more, but I'm pretty comfortable that these numbers early are more accurate, and it will keep improving its accuracy as it goes along. Well, this is the relation of violence and protest. You see here, the protest went up very high very quickly, but when that violence broke out on the bloody weekend, it dropped right back down and got to a lower level, sustained there, and then increased. As the violence began waning, the protest size began increasing, and we're seeing a lot of large protests now that are largely peaceful. We're seeing some with numbers of 60,000, 100,000, things of that size and nature, and it really goes to show that I think there is room for protests to be nonviolent, civil, peaceful, and you don't need confrontation police to get there either. There's a mix of escalatory tactics when it comes to believing a protest, again, chicken and the egg. If you believe a protest will go violent and you put in a heavy police force, and the protesters believe that heavy police force will attack them, you've got a combustible situation that is going to spark some tensions, or at least going to have opportunity for it. Whereas if you pull the police back, you give space, you allow the protest to occur, and the focus can be more on the sustainable change. If you think about where are the protests now in terms of mass movements, those protest size I was able to calculate, they're right now at about 500 to 600,000 people in total have attended protests from the beginning through June 7th. And again, that number is probably low just because it's very hard to account for every protest in a small town, but you could see it was tracking hundreds of different protests. So let's say that number's low by a factor of 3. There's 1.5 million people who have protested. When we use Chenoweth's number of what it takes to get a mass movement to create nonviolent change, the threshold effect is 3.5% of the population. So 3.5% of 320 million people, you're talking close to 12 million people. You can see the gap, even as major and sort of all-encompassing in the media as these protests and the reform movements that have come on top of them are, you can see the gap that still remains in terms of mass mobilization. What does truly mass mobilization look like, and how much 3.5% of the population is when it mobilizes, how much force that is, even nonviolent force, to drive for change. So it's something with these protests. I'm glad to see that the violence is down. I'm glad President Trump got rebuked by the military in his use of the Insurrection Act. That was a concern last week. Almost universal condemnation across the board from the military. All the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary, Chief of Staff, and Sergeant Major of the service, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, National Guard, all of them came out very strongly against the use of the Insurrection Act. You saw former generals like General Mattis weigh in. I think that rebuke of the Insurrection Act, as well as the realization from a lot of municipalities and counties that these local heavy police responses weren't working, led to that pullback last week where the violence begins declining, the arrests begin declining. It's a virtuous cycle, right? Again, it's not which came first, because this is very interwoven. It's not like the police had to withdraw first and then the protesters got peaceful, or there was no rioting. It's a mix of things. The protesters themselves saw, we don't want it to go this way, and you can see videos all over where they're trying to police themselves and keep some of the looting and vandalism in check. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.